My name is Tony Flach. I'm one of the panelists today, but I'm also providing the back-end support. So I'll be monitoring the chat for any questions that you have throughout the day. This session, as you've just noticed, is being recorded. That recording usually processes within 24 hours. So look for an email from us containing a link to a shared folder that will contain that recording, as well as any other materials that are referenced throughout our discussion today. That email usually comes out in 24 to 36 hours after our session is concluded. We're again placing everyone on mute to limit background noise, but please don't hesitate when you have the opportunity to unmute and pose any questions orally if you'd like, and always use that chat feature. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug to kick us off.
Well, hi friends, this is Doug Reeves, and I really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. I want to first of all acknowledge that the title of today's discussion about PLC Lite versus PLC Right comes from the late Dr. Rick Dufour. The last article that he wrote, he co-wrote with me before he passed away, and that was The Futility of PLC Lite. And what Dr. Dufour and I attempted to do in that article was to close the gap between people who say that they're doing professional learning communities and what they're actually doing. Because what we've learned over the course of many decades is that although professional learning communities, as Rick envisioned them, has the opportunity to create an enormous leverage point for your schools in terms of student achievement and staff motivation, that leverage will be evaporated if we don't actually get to what real PLCs do. So the purpose of our time together in the next 45 minutes is to close that gap between what PLCs can do and what they really are doing in your schools. I will just tell you that many of you are spending the same amount of money, the same amount of time on professional learning communities, but if you don't close that gap, then frankly, all we're adding to is the frustration and aggravation among our teachers. I am so lucky and delighted to be able to be joined today by our panelists. That includes Dr. Michelle Cleveland. Dr. Cleveland is not only a district level leader, but has been one of the most astounding building level leaders that I've ever seen, really taking PLCs and putting them into action. She's done this in some of the most difficult environments that you can imagine, very high poverty, very high EL, and yet she does so with wisdom and grace. Dr. Cleveland, we're so pleased to have you join us, so welcome.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reeves. You're gonna make me cry this morning or this afternoon.
And Tony Flach, many of you know him if you've been on these webinars before as my colleague at the Leadership and Learning Center, but you may not know that Tony was also one of the architects of the Broad Award-winning Norfolk Public Schools that won the prize for the best urban school system in the United States. Tony literally went from third grade teacher to district level architect of improvement. And in the intervening years has had a profoundly important impact, not only in Norfolk winning the Broad Award, but also around the United States. Tony, we're delighted to have you join us this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much for being a partner and a colleague, and glad to be with you all today.
So let's start with this question. You know, we're all coming out of a really tough time. And so one of the things that we want to focus on is the issue of student achievement. But we would be naive if we don't also deal with the fact that you can't get to achievement if you don't also address behavior. So Michelle, let me start with you. How are you dealing with the reality of difficult behavior? And by the way, I should maybe clarify that I'm talking about students, not just behavior of staff members, though that's a separate issue we'll get to later on. But how are you dealing with behavior, attendance, and achievement right now?
So in our district, and I know at my former site, I know we are continuing to really lean heavily into PLC teams and using those structures and employing, you know, the idea of grade level PLCs across tier 2 teams, tier 3 teams, leadership teams, any group of adults that are coming together to address behaviors, trends that we address through data. We use those principles of a PLC. And so really focusing on what the data is telling us, and then how can we make collective decisions together to address the behaviors and things that we're seeing. how are we going to measure our progress? And then, what's the timeline for making adjustments to the plan that, we've put in place? It is an understatement to say that it is a challenge at our school sites right now. I know I'm seeing it in our district and districts that I'm visiting with. Our educators are working really hard. So part of our role as leaders is really getting in there and streamlining their work and making sure that when we are putting the time and energy in, that we're doing it on the things that are going to make a difference in the moment.
Now, Michelle, I want to represent, and I know Tony will probably be monitoring the chat and we'll get other questions, but let me anticipate a question that you're going to get. When you say we should be using data, look, everybody on this call feels like, my God, we're drowning in data. We've got all the data we can handle. What data do you find from the perspective of a building and district leader that is most important so we can get rid of the chaff and just focus on what's most important?
So, it's different for what you're looking at. If it's student behavior, it's observable. It's what's going on in the classroom. It's the information from the teachers, suspension data, referral data, all of those pieces. There's sometimes autopsy data because it's not what's going on in the moment. And so if we can shift our conversations around observable data in the moment in time, then we're able to address things more quickly and oftentimes more practically. Because when we oftentimes look at the end of a quarter or at behavioral data or attendance data, the conversation more becomes, well, what happened? And we're, kind of documenting the reasons for it instead of actually addressing the issue in the moment and then building from that so that we can change the behavior.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And without belaboring the point, Tony, I'm going to go to you in a second. The real essence of what data counts are the data about the students we have in front of us right now. Mm-hmm. A lot of districts are drowning in data from last year. And however interesting, as Michelle just pointed out, an autopsy that might be, that doesn't tell me about the students that I have right now. So I want yesterday's data. I want last week's data. What can I do to make tomorrow make me a better teacher, make me a better administrator? Tony, how about you? What are you seeing in terms of behavior and achievement that we can best have insights from right now?
Well, I think, if you think about what a PLC is supposed to be, it's a group of educators coming together to collaborate around a problem of practice. And as Michelle said, the reality right now is, as much as we want to focus on academics with the return to school and all of those transitions, behavior has been a professional challenge. And so actually just recently here in Ohio, they call PLCs TBTs for teacher-based teams, was working with a team who was giving a good faith effort, a fifth grade team of teachers, good faith effort to focus on academics. And yet they kept coming back to some of the root causes. They were digging into the errors that they were seeing in the work. As they were digging into the instructional needs, they kept coming back around to behavior as a need, that was interfering with the learning. And so they actually took on themselves a behavioral goal and an academic goal. And they selected a specific behavioral practice. They focused on using specific praise to redirect off-task behavior, to reinforce on-task behavior. And they kind of monitored their adult actions. Like Michelle said, it was the checkup, the real time. Monitor those actions. They came back in, and the next month when I went to visit them, they had data both about the disciplinary issues, which had significantly reduced, as well as gains in their focus on the academic side. And so this was a team that owned the problem and did something about it.
But by the way, colleagues, I just want to brag on Tony for a moment. He is the co-author of an article that was just published this week in the All Things PLC magazine. And if you want a copy of that, please just email us or drop us a note in the chat room, and we'll make sure that you get that. Tony, the superintendent that he was talking about, Jill Ackerman, Teresa Gantz, the director of education, co-wrote this. And it's a very compelling study of how do you take PLC from Lite to PLC right. So I don't want you to think this is just theoretical. Tony as his own work has demonstrated, has turned that into action. Can I just say one more thing before we go to our next question? And Tony, please keep an eye on the chat room because I don't want to ignore what our colleagues are saying. When it comes to the interaction of discipline and academic achievement. Sometimes people get the directionality wrong. I just want to be really honest here. I'm a middle school teacher. Look, anybody on this call who's taught middle school knows what I'm about to say. If you have not taught middle school, and if you have not been tempted to be really frustrated with kids, you're lying. Of course they're frustrating. I understand the issue of discipline, but here's the problem. If you think you first have to put the hammer down and then we'll get to academic achievement, you got the directionality wrong. The best way to improve discipline, and this is not just middle school, this is at every level. The best way to improve discipline is first reduce the failure rate. Stop students, and this is especially true right now. This is being recorded in March, in the springtime of 2022. The biggest problem every spring is kids who have lost hope, who are angry, who have given up, and they will do everything in their power to make your lives miserable if we do not give them the opportunity to come back. So you want better discipline? Don't say put the hammer down. You want better discipline? Reduce failure. If you reduce failure, then you'll have better discipline. Then it becomes this virtuous cycle. So thanks for letting me get off that off my chest, because I think it's really important. Tony, before we go to the next question, anything in the chat room that we need to
tons of interest in the article. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for that. We'll send out a follow-up email, usually within 36 hours, that'll contain a link to this recording, as well as other resources that we discussed during the session. So look for that email in 36 hours. If you don't see it, please feel free. I'll put my email directly in the chat here. But Doug, as you were talking about reducing the failure rate, okay, at the risk of offending any secondary colleagues that are on here, sometimes the greatest challenge that I've encountered with PLCs is in the secondary social studies department. And there's just something deep. I see a couple of nods on the cameras there, so folks may have experienced my pain. There's something about the passion for history that just doesn't always jive with the PLC process. But I want to share something a team that I've been working with for 2 years now did. They changed their practices. They realized that they couldn't kill themselves. They wanted to change grading practices and provide more feedback and more opportunities for success, Doug, just like you're talking about. But they also realized that they couldn't manage all of that individually. And so one of the team leaders actually decided to, he'd give the assessment, he'd give his students very specific feedback on the parts of the assessment that they got right, parts that they got wrong. And then he would point them to a set of resources that he had posted in the district's learning management system and said, now you know what you need to learn more about, you go learn. And then gave them a 2-week window of opportunity to come back and retest on just those parts. And they've seen a really significant decrease in failures, decrease in disruptive behavior, and increase in academic performance. And the teacher is, acknowledging that COVID at least got him familiar with using an LMS, so he's now able to do that. And how much easier it's become for him because he's not having to chase down students to make them resubmit their work. So it's just a terrific example of how PLCs can own some of these really thorny issues.
And let me just really affirm, Tony, that that's not just about social studies, that's about all academic disciplines. Moreover, it's not just about assessment. That is about the emotional resilience that our students need. We've all been talking a good game about social and emotional learning. We've all been talking a good game about resilience and bouncing back from disappointment and failure. But the purpose of our discussion today is to put that into action. And the only way you put that into action is what Tony just said: give students the opportunity to actually, identify what went wrong, bounce back, and get it done. If I could offer everybody one idea to take away, it is: do not let your colleagues punish students this coming May for the mistakes that they made 3 months ago, 9 months ago. It's all about resilience. It's all about bouncing back. Michelle, one of the things that I wanted to ask you is there's a tremendous amount of turnover among leaders. And I'll bet we've got some people on this call who either are new leaders or going to be new leaders next year. What advice would you give to the new school administrator in terms of how to improve professional learning communities and how they can help students and adults create resilience in their schools?
So one of the things that I keep reminding other leaders that I'm working with is that the idea of a professional learning community is not a program. It's not something that you buy. It is something that your school site works on together every single opportunity that you get. It is a product that is never really finished. And so the idea of collective efficacy as being one of the major hallmarks of professional learning communities is what builds resilience in yourself as a leader and then within your teachers. And I think, and some of the teachers that I've talked to in the past year, as we've been working with PLCs, one of the things that they did share was, if I didn't have the structure of a PLC this past year, I don't know if I would still be in the profession. And I've had more than one teacher share that with me. And I think it is because once you get to a state as a school site where you've built systems and structures, that the teachers have been a part of that building. You haven't done it to them, you've done it alongside them, that there's been adjustments made as a collective leadership group where there's teacher voice. There's an empowerment in that you see start to filter into the classroom. In thinking about grading, one of the schools that I'm working with here in California, they weren't really big on allowing kids to retest. As they've gotten further into this process of sharing data together, looking at, skill versus will, looking at, I've got these 20 kids that they could do this. If I just tweaked a couple of different things, I think they'll pass. All of a sudden that conversation has shifted. Yeah, I think I'm going to build in a time for them to reassess. Do you think you're going to do that? Yeah, I think I'm going to do that too. And that was a conversation that I was in this morning that probably wouldn't have happened 3 months ago. And so it really is in remaining and holding tight to the process of a PLC, in being the leader that is holding people accountable, but doing so in a way that you're walking alongside them, that you're in the trenches, that you're coming from a servant leadership perspective, as opposed to top down. And I think those are the things that are saving the school sites right now.
That's such a thoughtful insight, Michelle. And part of what I want to encourage all of our colleagues as we, again, invite your questions and your comments and challenges throughout this discussion, is to think about what Michelle just said, because it is not just about resilience among the kids, it's about our resilience. I'm worried about teachers who are leaving our profession. A survey that many of you probably saw this week, 48% of teachers are considering leaving. The professional learning community process that we're talking about, the encouragement, the reduction in failure, the collective efficacy that Michelle just addressed, that's part of how you're going to save our profession. That's how you're going to save people from making the decision, shall I just leave or can I still commit? So we really have an obligation to keep our colleagues in the game, because if we don't, too many people are getting discouraged and giving up. Moreover, we've got to make sure, if any of you are lucky enough to have student teachers right now, we got to keep them in our profession and stop them from leaving, because I'm really worried about those who are seeing the pandemic failure around them, all the fallout of the last couple of years, and are just giving up. So listen to what Michelle just told you. Tony, anything to add or anything in the chat room?
So yeah, several questions have come in from the chat room. Question from Adam, and Michelle, I'll take a stab at the first response, but certainly welcome you and Doug to chime in here. But Adam writes, what are examples of goals and observable behavior that you're seeing in highly effective PLCs? So Adam, just today, working with a group of teachers who decided to put a focus in, going back to good old Robert Marzano's work around reinforcing effort and providing recognition. They wanted more effort from their students. And so they established a goal looking at how many of their students are giving them a level 3 or level 4 effort. They put a rubric in place to define that effort, from a level 1 being, hey, I drooled on my desk, to a level 4 being, I stuck with it even when I couldn't figure out the answer, I kept going. And that's what they're going to start tracking. So, they did spend some time working on what does this look like? How do we measure it? Well, we can define effort. So they work through a process of engaging students and reflecting on their effort. students, sometimes most of the students are going to be really honest with us. Sometimes there's a student that's like, yeah, I gave you a 4. No, you were sleeping today. So you'll have to conference with a couple of students, but most part they're going to be pretty honest, and that's some tangible data that they can measure, and they believe it, and I believe it'll have an impact on their performance.
And Michelle, I want to toss this to you as well, but colleagues, I just want to notice something that Tony just said very subtly, and that's the difference between effect data and cause data. Effect data would be, how did they do on their test? The cause data is, how engaged are they in the classroom? What you just heard Tony talk about are things that are relevant cause data. And what I want to encourage all of you as educators and as leaders to do is focus on the causes, not just effects. Michelle, how would you address our commentator? And by the way, Tony, please invite our person who raised this question to unmute and pursue this line of questioning first.
Yeah, Adam, absolutely. Please feel free after Michelle responds.
So I actually have a one-pager I've been using with principals in our district. So I'll make sure you guys get a copy of it, but it's kind of a little bit of a compilation of some of the critical points out of the article that Doug mentioned earlier, the PLC Lite, and then some additional research I've done the past couple of years as I've worked on my dissertation. One of the biggest pieces that is often missing as we implement PLCs as leaders is we forget to be checking in on our teams and providing them regular feedback, and really checking in on them to make sure that they have an agenda, that they are focused during the time that they're coming together. That whatever that agenda is really reflecting, talking about student progress, the data point that they're measuring, the goal that they're working towards, as Tony mentioned, and then what are they doing with that information? So is there shifts that they're asking each other about in terms of instructional practice, in particular about those academic goals? Are they deciding on additional assessment or data points that they want to pull to use? But what are those meetings really looking like? Are they holding tight to really following those 4 questions each meeting that they're together? And are you as the leader providing yourself a system to get in there and give them that feedback? What does that look like for you as you're leading this work? Because it's really important that our teachers get feedback just the way that our students also need feedback from their teachers. And so in a way, we're modeling for them what we would want to see happening in the classroom. And so keeping those cycles open.
Michelle, one of the things that you just made me think about is how I've been rethinking those 4 questions. And just to be clear with everybody, they are, what do we want students to learn? How do we know if they've learned it? What do we do if they don't? What do we do if they already have? And the shorthand I've been using is to save all of you some time, because I know some of you spend way too much time taking minutes, filling out forms, doing PLC, rubrics, and so on. Give yourself a break. All you need is a 4-line email. And here's the shorthand for what Michelle just said: learning, assessment, intervention, enrichment. That's it. Just 4 things: learning, assessment, intervention, enrichment. Now, as I was listening to Michelle, here's how it literally in the last 10 days, I've been reforming my own thinking. And that is, we all know about learning. We'll do the lesson plan. We all agree, what do we want students to learn? How do we know if they've learned it? Many of you I know are doing common formative assessments, and I really appreciate that, though I would insist not as many as you should, common formative assessments. The third thing, however, is the problem. What do we do if they don't get it? And I've been calling that intervention. And one of the things I'm going to hold myself responsible for is to use my language better. Because when I say the word intervention, what a lot of people hear is, oh, that means it's somebody else's responsibility. That means tier 3. That means special ed. That means, pull out. Colleagues, that's not what I mean. I need to replace my language. Instead of saying intervention, I should call it good teaching. What do we do if they don't? That's not intervention. That's not somebody else. That's me. That's on me. If they don't know it, that's just called good teaching. And I need to take responsibility for that in my classroom. And of course, if they're already doing it, that's also on me. That's not the gifted and talented group. That's on me. In the classroom, what do I do to improve their teaching and learning? So that intervention and enrichment that we used to want to shove off to somebody else, that's my responsibility as the classroom teacher. Tony, what do you want to add, or what colleagues do we want to include here?
Well, so you and Andy and Maria in the chat are inviting me to get on my soapbox, which is that of don't fixate on the forms. Andy and Maria both asked a question of what tools we've seen for analyzing student work or frameworks that have been successful. And folks, there's dozens of them out there, going all the way back to the days of the Annenberg Institute and looking at student work protocols, hot and cold feedback, you name it. But what I found is that those tools are often put in place, or the forms are often put in place, when there's an incomplete understanding of the purpose, the intent of professional learning communities. And so we come to fixate on filling in the right cell in the spreadsheet or putting the right note on the line in the minutes, rather than stopping and asking each other those 4 questions that Doug and Michelle both referred to. What do we want the kids to learn? How are we going to know when they do that? What do we see in the work samples in front of us that give us evidence about that? There are foundational pieces, and I think oftentimes we look to tools and frameworks as a replacement for doing some of the foundational work necessary to help PLCs be successful. So I want to give you one good example. A science team, middle school administrator had a science team that literally began first quarter of the year, wouldn't even make eye contact with each other in their PLC time. The room was so uncomfortable. I needed to be sedated after a 45-minute meeting because I felt like my skin was itching. That was the tension in the room. We finally asked the team, hey, what's going on? We showed them a video of another team in their school that was pretty darn functional. And we said, what would it take to get your team where that team is? And hats off to the team lead. He was incredibly courageous. He actually put his pencil down. He looked up around the room and he said, that team's been working together for 2 years. They've had time to plan, make lessons, work on their units. We're brand new. We haven't had the time to do that. To her credit, Julie Stewart, the principal, said, okay, you will not engage in the formal PLC process the next 4 meetings. That'll be structured planning time for you. It's not unlimited. We have to get back into the process. But after a month, they came back together, and it's one of the best teams in her building now. So there are tons of, if people want to email any of us for specific tools that we've seen or used, we're happy to. But folks, my caution to you is don't let those tools substitute for some of the hard work. Michelle talked about the leadership involvement that's necessary, the blocking and tackling to set your teams up for success.
Well, which leads to the question that I want to ask Michelle to address next, and that is, what about the barriers? I mean, it's very easy for Rick Dufour and I and many other exponents of professional learning communities to talk about what the ideal is. But the practical reality that a lot of you face is, I don't have the time. I'm too busy. The kids are out of control. All these barriers. What I would really like to learn from you is, how can you help our colleagues who are on this call today overcome the barriers that are interfering with the effective implementation of professional learning communities? Because structural, and let me just be clear before I toss to Michelle, there are structural issues. Okay, give them the time, put it in the calendar. We've all got there. We're sitting at the table. And if you were with me in person, I would show you the visual aid that I always like to do of a PLC meeting that I was in, where the chairs were literally turned aside from the building. In other words, you can make me show up to this meeting, but you can't make me collaborate. So I'm not talking about the timing. I'm not talking about the easy stuff. I'm talking about the hard stuff, Michelle. If you were coaching me, how would you help me overcome the barriers to collaboration?
So one of the things that is a huge barrier right now is time for our leaders. And I will say that one of the things as a leader that I did was prioritize the PLCs above everything else. That is really hard for our leaders right now. And I recognize that fully. There are a lot of people pulling at our school site leaders, and then that turns into pulling on the teachers in the classroom. And so one of the pieces of advice that I give our district leadership here, and that I'm trying to really communicate with our principals, is that it needs to be the top priority, and everything else that we need to get done can run through the umbrella of a PLC.
Yeah.
Everything you want to get done in your classrooms, we can get there through the collective efficacy in these grade level teams. But we have to honor the time that we're providing, not only to our educators in the classrooms, but to ourselves as the leader leading that work. And so you have to make tough choices sometimes to let other things go. And often as the leader, that means you deal with that however you need to, and you apologize later. But you make the PLC the priority, because the one thing that I will tell you, and Doug is 100% correct, when you structure it and you get everybody into a room, that's one thing. But the real power in the professional learning community comes in the conversations that these teachers have. And there has to be a culture developed that takes time to do. And you sometimes get that done through consistency and not letting it go, and not letting the little things erode your PLC. And I know one of the quotes from one of the DeFore books a long time ago talked about the ways PLCs die at schools is not through something big, but through very small erosions of commitment to practice over time. And so I think, as leaders, it sometimes overcoming the barriers means that you really have to make tough choices in practice for yourself. And sometimes you face consequences for that.
I'm smiling so broadly because I just literally finished a book that'll come out in April with John Hattie about implementation. And one of the things that we learned in the course of writing that book is the idea of de-implementation. So what you just heard Michelle say is you can't just talk about what you want to do. You got to talk about what you're willing to stop doing. And that's really hard. That's the William Faulkner, killing your darlings. I loved this idea. And let's be blunt, colleagues. We all loved technology in March of 2020, 2 years ago. We've learned a few things in the last 2 years. And you can't engage in the sunk cost fallacy of, oh my gosh, we bought this technology in March of 2020. We still have to be using it. No, you don't. There are things that you can stop doing. And as Michelle just said, you can't start these great new ideas if you're not willing to stop doing things. And that's what Hattie and I attempted to say in this book is you can't implement without de-implementing. Tony, what do we have in the chat room?
Yeah, so a couple things just came through. Eric asked about PLCs in the art, music, and PE world. And so I'll extend the same offer to anybody that may have missed it in the chat. I've seen some really great PLCs in those places. In fact, one I'm thinking of right now is called the Essentials Team. It's the art, music, and PE teacher. They're working around things in support of their content. So the PE teacher is working on procedures. The band teacher is working on, correct position of the fingers and all of that. But they're collaborating around the student thinking that happens in that area. Again, in support of their content. And I'm happy to connect folks with the principal and that Essentials team leader that I think are just doing a phenomenal job. Just send me an email. Another question that just came up from Andrea was, what steps do you recommend an administrator take when students in a specific grade level are actually showing drops in their diagnostic assessment scores from one administration to the other, and the PLC isn't going well? Andrea, starting to reply to you in chat, but I'll do it orally. Great question, and like so many things, really incredibly complex. I think one thing I'd want to take a look at is, have students received any feedback from those teachers on their scores on the assessment? Do they understand what that assessment is doing, how teachers are using that data, how they as learners should use that data? If not, my guess is they haven't. Then they are most likely thinking, oh, this is just something I got to do. And so it could be that drop that you're seeing is actually not a reduction in academic performance. It's a reduction in engagement and taking the stupid test. It's a waste of my time as a learner. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I'd suspect with what you're describing as a PLC that's not functioning well either, that those kind of what Doug referred to as cause data actions aren't happening. And so maybe that's something that you take a look at with that team, is some student goal setting around the data, giving them the feedback on that, talking about what they can do to improve their performance. What does the data say they're strong in? What does the data say their opportunity for learning is? And set some goals with the kids as a PLC. That be the thing the PLC monitors. I bet you'll start to see better function because it's something that's relevant and important to the students and to the teachers.
So I want to jump into these questions in reverse order. First of all, when people say that there's a drop in performance, I always go back to, let's ask some hard questions about the data. As a classroom teacher, and that's always the seat that I sit in, as a classroom teacher, do I know the items? I'm really worried about a lot of the things that are out there called formative assessments that I think are more appropriately labeled uninformative assessments, because they don't tell me as a teacher, how do I use that data to be a better teacher tomorrow? So I see things that are called gains and drops, but I don't know what they are. And there's a lot of things that are being sold, and a lot of money and time is spent on these assessments that really don't tell you, are the kids getting better or are they getting worse? So first of all, let's just challenge the underlying assumption of the data first. If I wrote it, if I know the items, I know that what they got right 2 months ago, they didn't get right today, great. I'll call that a drop and I can address that. But if all I see is a difference in two numbers and I don't know what's behind those numbers, then that becomes fairly opaque. And I think we need to challenge that. So let's be really clear. Those of you who are district administrators, I want you to be very critical consumers of anything that's called a formative assessment that does not inform teaching and learning. However, I got to go back, Tony, to what you said from your previous inquirer about music, art, and PE, because you are the author of this. Tony, one of Tony's great articles is this amazing school that had every single teacher, including music, art, PE, math, science, you name it, doing nonfiction writing. And you can walk down the hallway and you can see that everybody did nonfiction writing, because the evidence is clear, not just mine, but Stephen Graham, Karen Chenoweth, others, that says that nonfiction writing really works. And by God, it worked. You can see the same kid to same kid comparison get better and better and better. And it was because music, art, PE, everybody made it work. So please don't think that those people are marginalized. One other shout out that I want to offer for those people who are feeling isolated is the website allthingsplc.info. If you feel like you're alone, maybe you're in a small district, maybe you're in a singleton, I'm the only music teacher, I'm the only art teacher, go to allthingsplc.info, you'll find somebody else like you. So we really do believe that every single teacher has a role to play. Before we go to the next question, and I'm mindful of the clock here, we're going to run out of time in about 7 minutes. Michelle, anything to add about those people who are feeling marginalized?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tony. I think it oftentimes our singletons, or our, in particular at the secondary level, it is our PE and our elective club, they do feel left out. And so I think you always have to have that in the back of your mind as you're planning to engage with staff. And the other piece is there's always something that we can get them outside of the box to collaborate on. It just takes some intentionality in planning those conversations ahead of time. And in the groups, I've always found there's always an early adopter among your singletons that will really engage and get excited. And that tends to kind of filter through the rest of the group. And as they start to find success in their collaboration, it spreads. And so I agree with everything.
I'm smiling so broadly because one of the great pleasures of my life is getting to observe classrooms. And one of the teachers that Michelle mentored, Mr. Webb, was a middle school band teacher. And you could walk in there with 55 kids, of whom, this is a high poverty school, remember, nobody had private instruction. Nobody was going to Juilliard. He did, but in this giant student to teacher classroom, they not only had masterful command of the music, but they were able to encourage one another. They were able to support one another. And all those executive function skills that Mr. Webb did, thanks to Michelle and her mentoring, all those executive function skills that they did in that class poured over into math, into ELA, into science and social studies. So I don't want anybody to think that math, that music and art and PE are peripheral. They are the heart and soul of what really helps the entire school did. And it was a great memory, Michelle. I really am so happy that you brought that back to my mind.
Yeah, one of our students actually from that class, Doug, was invited to play in the Vienna Orchestra.
Oh my God.
That's awesome.
It's amazing.
So another question from Thomas in the chat, folks. So how do you define what is not working and balance replacing that with what could work? Doug,
Well,
you want to take a stab at that?
So let me start and then invite you to chime in. Let's be really clear about what works means, because, and this is a good opportunity, by the way, colleagues, for anybody who's a conceited researcher like me to admit when we're wrong. By the way, beware of the researchers who are always conveniently right. We got to admit when we're wrong. So I'm about to do that. In the definition of what works is, we say, well, gee, I tried this and it didn't work. Well, maybe you tried it and maybe you didn't. What works is deep implementation. That's the Hattie book that I was talking about a minute ago. So in this study that I conducted, which is a classic example of me being wrong about things, I thought, well, shoot, if I implement deeper, then deeper and deeper and deeper means better and better and better in terms of student achievement. I was dead wrong. Here's what the data said. A little bit deeper, nothing. A little bit more deeper, nothing. A little bit more deeper, nothing. Only at the deepest level of implementation did we see student results. So when Tony asks what works, please don't fall for the plea that says, oh, gee, just buy this program and it works. What you got to say is, if you don't implement whole hog, don't even bother, because a little bit of implementation gets you nothing. And that's why people buy one program after another, because they'll say, well, shoot, we tried that program, that didn't work. Let's buy another program. Lots of federal funds coming in. Let's buy another one. Oh, shoot, that one didn't work either. Let's buy another one. That one didn't work either. Let's buy another one. I'm telling you, colleagues, it's just what Michelle said a few minutes ago. It's not what you buy. It's not programs. It's practices. A few things that really are implemented at a deep level, not a great number of things that are implemented superficially. So thank you, Mr. Flach. That was very therapeutic for me to get that off my chest. I appreciate that.
Channeling our guests. So another question from Ron. He'd be interested in comments of PLC versus by grade level versus PLC by subject area. And I think that's some of what Michelle was talking about with Singleton. So prime example right now, my wife is the only 5th grade math teacher in her building. And so when she meets in their PLC, it's mostly as a grade level. The challenge is they're really struggling to find something productive around which to collaborate. So what they're focusing on is the approach of problem-based learning. So I think in those instances where I've seen the greatest success, I kind of step back from content-specific discussions to more metacognitive or instructional practice discussions that are broadly applicable. Doug mentioned another one, nonfiction writing, also works well in that area. That being said, as the only math teacher, she also needs that opportunity to collaborate with other math teachers, even if they are in other grade levels. And so to her school's credit, she's getting that opportunity once a month as well. So I'd encourage you to think about and rather than or in that instance. Michelle, what thoughts do you have about grade level versus subject area?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think you can do both. I think at your secondary sites where you will see this often will be in math, because you may have, in California, we have integrated math 1, 2, and 3. Those are going to span grade levels, but it really then becomes about the content and the skills. And so it works effectively. The other thing I would say with this, if it's a barrier of, as Tony was saying, there's not another 5th grade math teacher. This is where we call on everything we've learned in the past 2 years. And we look for ways to offer our singletons collaboration time virtually. If they can't get together physically, we now know that we can get together virtually in a virtual space and accomplish an extraordinary amount. And so, working with colleagues that may also have a singleton at their site and finding times and structures to really support that collaboration, it really helps.
Yeah. And I would just add one more thing, and Tony, we're going to have one more, and then we're going to have to close.
Yep.
I think there's actually a great advantage to having people who are not on the same grade level and not in the same subject. And that is when it comes to collaborative scoring. A core practice of professional learning communities that is oftentimes overlooked is collaborative scoring the same piece of student work. And I'm so pleased that you are willing to talk about your Michelle, 5th grade math teacher, because when everybody else sits there and looks at a problem and all the kids get it wrong, they say, well, oh shoot, they just weren't paying attention. They weren't following instructions. And so I've been in these PLC meetings and I'll say, okay, let's all of us do it. So now I've got a bunch of college educated professionals who are looking at the same thing and getting it wrong. Oh, gee, the directions were ambiguous. That was a terrible problem. The instructions were wrong. We put ourselves, when we can go together outside of our grade level, outside of our subject matter, in the shoes of students, we are dramatically more empathetic to what our kids are going through. So those of you who may be singletons, or those of you who may be supervising singletons, that's actually an enormous advantage, because you will learn from the experience of trying to do a problem that is alien and foreign to you. Tony, we have time for one more, and then I'm going to close.
Yeah, so I think, folks, the last piece that I'd like to offer up is don't forget to take a look at the fundamental pieces. Aside from a lot of what we've talked about, one of the most common errors that I see that we haven't addressed is that teachers are not bringing the right student work to the table. That's a result of the assessments that they're trying to use. So my key to success that I've seen in teams is when PLCs have some evidence of student learning that they can analyze to use to be diagnostic, those teams are successful then in talking about the instructional practices that they want to put in place. If the assessment only tells them right or wrong, they're left really with, I'm going to teach it louder, maybe slower, maybe a couple of more days. So take a look at the assessments that they're bringing. If your teams are struggling, they may not be looking at the right things.
Well, and that's a good note to allow us to close on, and that is that every teacher in the planet is overwhelmed. They've got too much stuff to do. So let's one thing that I've learned from being privileged enough to watch you is to stop with the big assessments, 2 or 3 item assessments. Don't spend your Sunday nights grading papers. 2 or 3 items, things that I can do right now in the classroom, give students immediate feedback. One of the things that Rick and I talked about in that article about PLC Lite is that we have to be able to give both our teachers and our students feedback that is immediate and specific. So I think if you will leave this conference by saying, I'm not, please don't say, oh, I heard Michelle and Tony and Doug talk. I've got more things for you to do. You will not be a popular person. But if you leave here today saying, here's how I can save you time. And one way to save teachers' time is to have mini assessments, 2 or 3 items, not 20 or 30 items, 2 or 3, give people immediate feedback. And then this very semester, in the next 2 or 3 months, reduce the failure rate, forget the average, give people credit for what they're doing. I just want to say on behalf of Dr. Cleveland and Tony and myself, how much we appreciate the fact that you're willing to spend time with us. We know how valuable your time is. We also want to invite you to continue this dialogue. If you didn't have an opportunity to participate as you wished, I hope you will all get personal emails from me. And I promise you, I'm not doing anything else. Email me. I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but like the guy on TV says, I've seen a thing or two. So please email me, and I'll make sure that if I don't have the answer, then Dr. Cleveland, Tony, or my colleagues at the Leadership and Learning Center will be able to respond to you. So thanks. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. I really appreciate all of your time.
All right. As Doug said, ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a follow-up email to this webinar, usually again in about 36 hours once the recording has processed. That email will come out from Doug with links to the shared folder. Also, as he mentioned, an invitation to set up a conversation. There are a ton of questions, folks. We appreciate your interest. We apologize we weren't able to address them all, but don't let today be the end of the conversation. So thank you all for your time and attention. Have a great rest of the day.